Добрий день і вітаю всіх, хто приєднався.
Good morning. I want to thank everybody who joins us. My name is Ola Atamanova, and it's my pleasure to welcome you at Ukraine Media Center today. Today is day 950 of the full-scale invasion of our homeland by Russian aggressor. It's been 11 years of the war, and today we have invited you to discuss a very important topic. Today we are going to be talking about the ways to expedite the identification of persons killed and missing in action. So according to the latest information for the time being, the joint register of people missing in action contains more than 55,000 names, including military and civilians, both adults and children, and the figures keep growing. But we understand not always the identification processes are going on smoothly and quickly, just in a way that the families of those missing in action would like. So today we are going to discuss what does work and what does not. Today we are going to be looking for the methods to improve the procedures. So let me introduce our speakers. Joining us today in our studio is Liena, the coordinator of Media Initiative for Human Rights. Also joining us is Mariia Mykhalko, head of the data coordination at the International Commission on Missing Persons Program. Also joining us is Artur, Dobroserdov, Ukraine's Commissioner for Missing Persons in Special Circumstances. Also joining us is Serhii, Kupchyk, Deputy Head of the Second Unit for Investigating Crimes Committed during the Armed Conflicts at the main investigative department of the National Police of Ukraine. And also joining us is Liena, Sikorska, Head of the Laboratory of State Register of Human Genomic Information of the State Scientific and Research Forensic Center of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Good morning, dear friends. Thank you for joining our discussion. So, Miss Liena, let me give the floor to you. We would like to discuss, first of all, you realized that today the number of the registered bodies is increasingly growing. So how the DNA testing is going on, what does work, what does not work in this procedure, and what are the obstacles that you see as the representative of the civil society. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. It's really an important topic, and it's really a complex one. We analyze and study this topic. Soon we are going to come up with an analytic opinion. Today we only have the small reference note talking about the number of people missing in action for the time being. We were submitting the request to the Secretariat of the Commissioner for People Missing in Action back then. As of August 2024, the register contained 2,410 unidentified bodies. So what is going on with the DNA testing? On my end, as a representative of a human rights organization, as I keep communicating with the families of those missing in action, I would like to outline a couple of problems that the families are facing normally. What we were talking about 2 years ago, we keep talking about the same things today. It's about the duration of DNA testing. We realized that Ukraine was not ready for such a number of people missing in action, killed in action, to the large number of unidentified bodies. We also realized that training of experts is a long-lasting process. It's impossible within such a short period to train sufficient number of experts to make the DNA testing expedited. But what the families say, it takes 8 to 10 months, sometimes it may take 12 months. We understand that the complexity is not only about the numbers. For example, the number of experts in the Ministry of Internal Affairs system is 240, and the number of samples that come on a daily basis may amount to 300. But based on what the representatives of the expert center say, I'm not trying to criticize them, we're just trying to settle the problems there. Well, and to explain it to the families the way it happens in practice, we don't only consider the side of the families, but also the representatives of the Ministry of Internal Affairs to understand how the processes are going on practically. So what the families are told that after the first expertise until the repeated one, it takes like 4 to 6 months, but in reality it may take up to 10 months, up to 12 months. In the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the reasons were quite banal. The investigation officers who had samples of DNA on them, they could have forgotten to send them to the laboratory. So back then, there was already a profile set up on the database, but the only thing that was missing, the DNA samples to identify the body. And only after the samples were sent to the laboratory, a person was identified, but the body was already buried, which resulted in exhumation of the body, which resulted in the repeated trauma for the family. Is quite a hard emotional process. So apart from duration and some human errors, there are, for example, cases when the families are reported that their DNA samples went bad, somehow got compromised, which results in the necessity to submit DNA samples once again re-traumatized the family. So it's probably about the lack of proper communication between the investigation officers and the families of the people missing in action. And the problem here is that the criminal investigations for civilians and the military are being sent from the place of submission to the place where the person was gone missing. And we understand that in those territories the investigation officers are difficult to communicate with because they have a significant workload over there. Thanks to the office of the commissioner, we managed to find their contacts, but I would like to make sure that the system works better so that the families are not forced to look for investigation officers, so that the communication is permanent. And again, as the case is being forwarded, is being sent from one place to another, it takes months, and within those periods the families of the people gone missing, they don't know who is their investigation officers. And while the logistic procedures are going on, the investigation officers may not even be identified. Also, I would like to note that some time is necessary to train the experts. In our opinion, as the human rights organization, we should involve more foreign partners. There is an international commission for people gone missing who has memoranda entered into with the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the main investigative department, with the Ministry of Justice, with the Ministry of Health. They have an extensive experience and they are limited with the capabilities defined by that memorandum, and due to the absence of agreement entered into with the government of Ukraine, they can only exercise those activities which are related with providing expert opinions. There are difficult posthumous cases, and there are cases when our experts, not due to the lack of their professionalism, but due to the complexity of the case, they cannot come up with a joint opinion and identify a person. So in our opinion, it's important to use the opportunities provided by International Commission for People Gone Missing, and they have joint trainings with our experts. So we would like to see more involvement on part of international specialists. That would, in our opinion, improve the results and probably even expedite the process, specifically in some complex cases. So those complications, those obstacles the families are facing, we should look for ways to settle them by increasing the number of specialists, by expanding the technical capabilities in terms of adding new laboratories, involving more international commissions. We understand that if such an agreement would be entered into, it would improve the situation significantly. We should improve communication with investigation officers and launch an awareness campaign among the families of the people gone missing, so we can explain to them what are the complications and why they arise. Thank you, Ms. Elena. Ms. Marina, let's proceed to you right away. You are representing the International Committee for the Persons Gone Missing. So, do we already have some common ground? Are we having any aligned procedures? And how, in your opinion, you could empower us, how you could help us expedite the processes, probably in what ways you could reinforce our capabilities to help the families of the persons gone missing to find justice and to find their loved ones. Thank you for your question. Thank you for having me here. Basically, for the time being, during this period that the International Commission on Missing Persons is staying in Ukraine, we've set up quite an efficient cooperation with the Secretariat of the Commissioner, with the main investigative department of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, just like Olena mentioned, all of those memoranda that were signed, and it definitely gives us a large amount of areas where we could cooperate, and definitely we favor the use of DNA samples as the key method of identification, since it's the least erroneous ones in identification of the dead bodies. But at the same time, we have to understand that identification is not only limited with DNA sampling, it's a lot of other investigation activities, and it's important to remember about the unity of different participants of the process. It's not only about the Ministry of Internal Affairs or National Police or search groups with which they all start. It's about the forensic laboratories involved as well. And definitely we try to support on our end the uninterrupted chain of evidences. So all of the materials that were gathered could be eligible for consideration by international courts, and our cooperation is not only limited with DNA sampling. So again, it's important to make sure that before the materials are submitted to the laboratory, there is already good coordination set up in terms of selection of samples and evacuation of bodies from the battlefield. But again, thanks to our cooperation, our International Commission takes part in sampling the DNA samples from the relatives of the missing persons who reside abroad. It's not the majority of the families, but at the same time, that's a significant number of persons. And in communication with the Ministry of Internal Affairs, it was published how much reference samples were submitted by International Commission for Missing Persons, how many people were able to match their DNAs, and how many bodies were identified as a result. Because again, identification is not only DNA sample, it's a lot of other investigation activities. But at the same time, on our end, we're trying to take all reasonable efforts to support the government agencies of Ukraine, and in compliance with the memorandum with the main investigative department, we're being involved by the investigation officers to genetic and molecular research. Is not a testing, as Olena said, but as experts, we share our opinions for certain cases, our vision. So what are the ways to improve our cooperation? Well, I can only comment on the end of the International Commission, and what we see based on the communication with the families of those missing persons, it's not 100% of those who report to the government agencies, to the national police, is just some certain drawdown, some fraction of those people. But at the same time, we try hear the people, to hear to their impressions about the procedures, how it's going on, and definitely the people sometimes are missing the communication with the investigation officers, because we understand how overloaded they are with investigations. We understand the tension that is going on in the libraries, because the amount of work is unprecedented. Basically, Ukraine, well, basically no country throughout the world can be ready to such an inflow, such a workload. And given the fact that the representatives of International Commission were visiting the laboratories under the aegis of the Ministry of Health, under the aegis of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, we give the government agencies their due. But at the same time, the amount of work Ukraine is facing is unprecedented. So on our end, we favor centralization of the search process, identification within the framework of the work of the Ministry of Internal Affairs and other agencies that can communicate between them more efficiently. But at the same time, we would like to see some further communication for the cooperation between all of the participants of the process, probably raising their level of knowledge, the expansion of material base, and the expansion of personnel, of staff, because the amounts of work are unprecedented. Mr. Artur, we understand that some fraction of the families are reporting to you directly. Well, definitely those were not the people for whom the procedure worked quite quickly. Usually those are the people who were facing some problems. So what can you tell us based on your experience, based on your communication? What are the obstacles and how can we overcome them? Well, for the time being, I can analyze the last year, how the processes of identification are going on, who plays which role and who does what, to make sure that this identification is more successful and more faithful, because we have no right to chase the speed, to try to expedite the process and to commit some errors in our way, because those errors are going to cost much to ourselves and to the families of those missing in action. We talk about the molecular testing, DNA testing, and really the majority of our agencies who do such expertise, they are loaded with the expertise of the residues that are being kept in our reserves. Our register has a section that is describing the unidentified bodies, and thus we understand what is their number, where they are, and what was done to them as a part of investigation activity. So identification is a job of investigation officers. That's the national police, that's the forensic agency work, and those experts who work in the system of national police, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and now other agencies are joining this work.
Ми бачимо, в якої кількості тіл відібрані зразки, передані на експертизу, виведено ДНК-профіль. Тобто,
basically, after that, we may say that it's more or less something that was done, and we're waiting for the matching, and our colleagues may tell in better detail how it works. What was important that this year the workload was redistributed. Back in years 23-24, the bodies that were delivered after repatriation were delivered to one or up to four such bureaus for DNA testing. Now the number of such bureaus has grown up to 15, which allowed us to better identify the bodies and to expedite the procedure. We have quite a good cooperation with international organizations, and it's important to get such samples for comparison. We keep getting such samples from abroad thanks to International Commission, thanks to the state enterprise document, which has branches in some of the European countries where our citizens can report to. Another important stage is the communication with the citizens. We understand that the people facing such a sorrow, they come to the bureau for visual recognition of the body, and very frequently we see that due to the stress, due to intense psychological shock, we keep getting calls, we keep getting reports about dissatisfaction of the family members of the people missing in action. But what's true is that the bodies that we get are coming to us in a very difficult condition, and there's a lot of work to identify them, and sometimes we don't manage to get the DNA samples from the first time. Sometimes it takes way longer, but in the majority of cases it happens quickly, but the work that is done quickly is not usually described in the media. But when it comes to some problems, yeah, the problems are usually highlighted. Another thing that the citizens were mentioning, probably it was some psyops, that the bodies that are handed over for repatriation, that are not being kept in the freezer, they are being sent to crematorium so that Ukraine cannot keep the toll. But I can assure you that such things don't happen. Every single body is being thoroughly investigated. Yet another issue is the storage, because really there's a lot of issues around this matter. The procedure says that if the body was not identified within 1 year, it can be stored in temporary sepulcher. There is already a land plot allocated in the municipal cemetery for storage of such bodies, but our task is to take all reasonable and possible efforts to make sure the body can be identified and recognized properly. We don't only use DNA sampling, we use visual recognition by other other characteristics, for example, such as fingerprints. Now we consider the use of dental formula. We are going to copy this experience from foreign institutions and implement them on our end. And again, territorial jurisdiction, that's another thing. You know, when the case is lasting too long and the family members don't know whom to ask to get the faithful information, to make sure that the samples they were submitted could be properly processed, whether there is a match or not. You know, this sending period that takes sometimes more than 2 months, it's a moment of uncertainty and absence of information. But now the police established the search centers in all of the regions. The same officers are going to be in charge of this, and they may be entitled to report the information to the family members. And we are planning to take some more steps that we are going to highlight as soon as they happen. Thank you very much. So, Ms. Liena, what is the way the DNA sampling is going on now? Or Mr. Serhii, maybe this question is to you. So yes, right, let me report in a sequence that is established according to the procedure. The DNA identification is going on in 2 ways. First, upon the report from the applicant, from a relative of a person missing in action, or from the bodies that are being returned to. And basically, there is a specific procedure identified for every such fact that is being processed. They're somewhat different between each other, and somehow they are coincide too. So as soon as we get the report, we register the criminal case. A person is being interrogated, and then then the DNA samples are being taken from the relatives. I'm trying to shorten it. I hope the majority of us spectators understand the way it happens. So the biological samples are being taken from the relatives. Then there is the genetic testing appointment to take the DNA samples and to put them to storage, and then it's more of an exchange of information. We exchange information with the Secretariat of the Commissioner for Persons Missing in Action, with the Coordination Headquarters, National Information Bureau, and with the military units. The internal investigation results, but basically I have to tell you, we have some problems with the military units, so please don't accuse the investigation officers. So let me just highlight the problems that were mentioned. Well, the jurisdiction. This problem was identified at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. We were trying to initiate an application to the Office of Prosecutor General. Well, we have the criminal code, and it's a requirement of the criminal code to exercise investigation at the place of the crime. Well, you cannot prevent a prosecutor not to comply with the law. Well, we've agreed it with the prosecutors that the cases should be submitted to the jurisdiction not earlier then the case is processed at the place of application, with the maximum of investigation activities used over there. So basically what I've mentioned: investigation, identification of witnesses at place of submission of report, DNA sampling from the relatives, DNA testing, and then we've decided that after that moment the criminal investigation is not handed over to the jurisdiction until all of those procedures were fulfilled. Yes, there is a problem with sending, but that's a physical thing. I'm not going beyond our competence. The investigation officer submits it to the prosecutor's office. It goes through all of the stages in prosecutor's office in compliance with all of the procedures. It goes from local level to regional, from regional to central, and then all the way down back to the local level at the place of investigation. The problem of communication, yes, it was highlighted. It has both subjective and objective factors. In my opinion, it's more about objective factors, and the main factor is the workload. It's the workload of investigation officers. We keep submitting the criminal investigations, and the majority of complaints for lack of communication arises at the jurisdiction of investigation. You know, as long as investigation officers has an opportunity to get in touch with every single applicant, such problem does not arise. But as soon as the case is being sent to the place of investigation, to Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia regions, Kherson region to some extent, well, mostly it's Donetsk region, the workload there is colossal. And what steps have we undertaken? What I can say is that for the time being, in every single regional center, there are centers for search of persons gone missing. It was made upon initiative of the National Police of Ukraine. There are organization procedures going on in Dnipro that will be the headquarters for all those problematic regions, but the awareness campaign was already launched. The people who report about their missing relatives, they will be made aware. We'll communicate the information to them so that everybody knows where to go. So the main task of those centers is the communication. People can report to the center at their place of residence, and they will be informed what is the status of the criminal investigation, and they can be put in touch with the local center where the investigation is going on. So when the centers are going to start working, they work in all regional centers except for Dnipro. Mr. Serhii, so let's look at it from the perspective on criminal investigations. What does the statistics say? What is the number of criminal investigations? I apologize, I'm not going to mention the figure, not because I don't know. The number is measured in tens of thousands. Can we mention some cases when we were able to identify the missing persons? And well, look, what I've highlighted is just one area of our work, from like the track as it's submitted from the relatives of missing persons all the way to the burial. Another track is the bodies delivered from the battlefield, which are not easily identified. It's due to the condition of the bodies. So the work of investigation officers starts upon delivery of the body to a forensic center, and every single body, let me assure you, I mean, you can assuredly tell it to the relatives of missing persons. Every single body is being thoroughly investigated. The DNA samples are being taken from every single body, and they are stored in the electronic register. If there is a match, it's being reported to the relatives. Additional investigations and studies are being done based on the recommendations that Ms. Olena may describe in detail. But again, it's about communication, informing. I know it's a difficult topic. In reality, informing is not contemplated by the law of Ukraine, like preliminary match or step-by-step informing of the applicants by the investigation officers. But understanding the problem, we've developed the joint procedure between the prosecutor's office, our agency, so in notification of the relatives, about identification, about forwarding of documents or DNA samples. But again, I'm ready to hear critics that it doesn't always work. I apologize, but there is a lot of subjective factors, again, both subjective and objective factors. It's impossible to inform all of the investigation officers in case of hundreds of criminal investigations in the same category. Thank you very much, Ms. Liena. Let me give the floor to you. I would like to touch upon the topic of duration of procedures. Is it regulated by legislation in any way? We've heard about subjective and objective judgment, about this being a long-lasting procedure, way longer than their families would like to expect. 8 to 12 months, it's a pretty long term. Can you please explain us why does it take so long? Well, as it was said by my colleagues, DNA sampling is only a minor fraction of all of the investigation processes that are going on to identify a missing body. DNA sampling starts with the moment when we get a DNA sample, and I would like everybody to understand that this is when the DNA sampling is starting. The sample comes to the expert's hands, and the expert starts working with it. In order to expedite the testing, we've processed a lot of and mastered a lot of new techniques. I cannot I cannot say that such procedures were copied by all of the institutions that deal with DNA sampling, because there's a number of agencies involved in the process. In the expert service of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the DNA sampling is fulfilled on a permanent basis starting from the year 2014, because this is when the war started. Every region, every single region has research and development facilities that have forensic laboratories. In 13 regions, there are full-fledged forensic laboratories that can study different samples with the different levels of complexity. There are laboratories which study the samples of the relatives, but there are laboratories that study the degraded, destroyed samples of the bodies. On top of them, they study the samples from the places of crime, but we're talking here mostly about those missing in action. Also, what's studied is the X chromosome, Y chromosome, mitochondrial DNA. So it's not a narrowed range of tests, but lately within the last couple of years, we've mastered new methods which allow us to use less relatives for identification of one body. Also, in those cases, we only need mothers. Previously, we needed both mothers and fathers, and now we can use either. We can proceed to confirmation whether using that method or the method with the both parents. The problem is that using one method is real difficult to identify a person. That's a purely mathematical calculation, and if, according to the database, we're having a match of a DNA sample with another DNA sample, we submit a letter to the investigation officer with the recommendations what to do after that. What more samples do we need? What not we, but what samples are needed to identify the body. We provide the recommendation, and upon our recommendation, the investigation officers act with the consideration of our recommendation letter, proceeding to other investigation activities. For example, one test of mother's DNA sample of cord DNA is not sufficient. If there is a match between a mother and somebody, it, according to the database, it's a probable match that should be confirmed with additional testing. The experts should study the X chromosome of the mother, X chromosome of the body, to match them, to compare them, and only then submit a report with the degree of probability of match. And such test opinion is already taken into consideration. Ms. Liena, is there any regulation, is there any procedure that you use in your work? I mean, in terms of duration, according to your internal procedures, how long can it take? Well, the DNA samples of people gone missing in action are studied within months. Well, and in complicated cases, well, a sample of a body may be real difficult. The problem is that the body is a biological material. The biological material, it degrades in a number of ways. To fulfill the test from the biological body until we get the electronic code, and we work with the electronic code, we have to exercise a number of manipulations. First, we have to sample the DNA, but in some cases there are some inhibitors to this process. For example, there are rotting processes that influence the material significantly. Also, on top of that, it's no secret that there is burnt material that should be sifted to identify small parts that can be studied. We study those small parts. I don't know how the audience perceives it, but that's a very diligent and thorough work. So as the sample gets to an agency, to the laboratory, it's being worked on. It doesn't just sit in a freezer, and we have a task not to leave it without fulfillment. Like, you use one sample, use one test, use one method, another method, try to sift it in one way to clear or to clean the sample in another way. And thus we've developed a number of protocols that resulted in these inhibitive factors to lessen their influence. And we want every single mother whose soldiers' children gone missing to get their children back, no matter how long does it take, 8, 10, 12 months. We just cannot leave the figures dry. You know, some tests are being done by the experts in a quick manner, but in some cases the experts submit their requests for submitting more samples. So in a situation when Miss Olena says that some specimens, some samples get deteriorated, she's right. Yes, any samples get deteriorated. It's biology. There's biologic material around us. There's a lot of viruses, a lot of microbes, a lot of fungi that aim to destroy small cells that the samples are made of. On top of that, there are chemical agents. There is fire. There is intense thermal effect on those samples. Again, those the rotting processes that penetrate all of the tissues of the human body, and we have to clear the body of those rotting elements. You know, they get into every single cell of a body. They saturate the body with that. Thank you. So, Mr. Serhii, when an expert says about the requirement for additional testing to get more relatives involved in those cases, how prompt is the reaction of investigation officers? You've mentioned that they have no obligation to communicate, but in those cases, how quickly do they react to make sure that those samples are being additionally processed? Well, those are different things. Communication about the like usual notification and fulfillment of the requirement or request of an expert. So again, that's another factor that may influence the duration of testing. On top of what Ms. Liena has said, well, pretty frequently we get the requests like, please provide the opinion that may be contained in a different criminal investigation. Can you get a repeated sampling? The investigation officers react, but on top of necessity to get this sample, it all requires the proper documenting so it can be used as a part of criminal investigation. You cannot just go and sample. You cannot just call a person and tell them, hey, give me your DNA sample. I mean, it's additional procedure. Those are the applications, additional procedural issues, procedural matters. Yes, the investigation officers, they do respond. This process is being directly controlled by the command, by their command of the investigation officers, but it takes time. Well, I think that another question is going to be for all of the panelists. So what would be the factors that can influence the speed of identification of the body? Something that you could advise to both the relatives or probably is being influenced by work of other agencies. Well, let me tell you about two things. First of all, we have a law on the state registration of genomic information of persons. It contemplates that during the martial law, every single military is supposed to submit their DNA samples, meaning if a military is going missing, the investigation officer takes samples from that system that ensures the continuous storage of their DNA samples. So we don't have to look for relatives, we have to just work with the system, with the DNA samples in that system. And if that serviceman was really killed in action and their body is being sent for identification, such comparison is going to happen quite quickly, and we remove the traumatic factor for the families. That's one thing. And also in many units this standard is complied with for a long time, and we hope that shortly we will be able to cover 100% of all of the military. Another thing that I wanted to mention, that we keep working, we keep looking for new options how to solve the problem with identification. We understand that the military who were killed and whose bodies are stored in bureau, they may not have relatives to match the DNA sample with. And now with the help of international organizations, we were consulted by an American company, and what we've agreed upon, we've made the 3D scan of the craniums. Our experts helped to sample the DNA profile in a way that that American laboratory can work with. We've sent all of the materials for processing in the United States, and we're waiting for the results that may reconstruct the facial features based on how profound they can search the DNA. After that, we may show the face to the public, and someone may be able to recognize visually their relatives. We keep looking for the new methods, for the new experiences all around the world. Thank you. Maybe someone can add. Let me add to what Mr. Artur has said. The sampling of DNA from the military, you know, the law identified that there should be procedures approved by every agency, and in the units of the Ministry of Internal Affairs it works perfectly, but in the armed forces it doesn't really work quite well. It's important to raise awareness among the military, because someone may perceive it as some bad sign, like sampling DNA. They don't understand that after the sampling they are not going to be sent to the laboratory, but they will be kept in the storage until the situation requires them to be sent to the laboratory. So in practice, when the military don't have relatives, they were looking for a way to sample their DNA, and the policeman said, the police said, we don't have criminal investigations initiated against you, so we have no procedure to sample your DNA. So only then they've applied to the secretariat to hand over the DNA sample to a trustee who could hand over the DNA to the laboratory. But in some cases the military were helped by the policemen, so in the military units that procedure has not started working so far, because it contemplates the identification of a person responsible for storage of DNA sampling, for DNA sampling itself. It's a process, it's a procedure, so we need to have this process coordinated in all of the government agencies. Talking about what we heard today, it's important to raise awareness among the families about the practical side of DNA sampling, how it works, how it's going on, so that the families have this understanding and they don't have this reaction like picking up different psyops that Mr. Artur was mentioning, so that people understand that those things are not real, because in reality the things are happening in a different way, just like they were informed by the representatives of National Police of Ukraine and other agencies involved in the process. Well, what could be the advice for those defenders who want to submit their DNA for sampling, but there is no procedure in place at their military units? What should they do? Well, maybe there are other ways rather than sampling the DNA from yourself. Again, sample it from yourself, it's not the right way. It should be fulfilled by an expert, not a person themselves, so that they can either sample the DNA from themselves. I mean, in those cases, I'm talking about the military who have no relatives, but again, we never analyzed how much would it cost for a military to submit their DNA and how much would it cost for their relatives. I don't know, reporting to a laboratory that can sample your DNA and store it for some time. It all depends on what laboratory it is, on its certification capabilities, and so on and so forth. So again, maybe my colleagues want to say something else. Well, I would like to say that the sampling of epithelium DNA is not a complicated procedure. We've worked with that procedure. We've already finalized it with the Ministry of Justice, with the colleagues from the National Police, our colleagues from the State Security Service of Ukraine, and there are no complications about it. The only thing that we need is to make sure, before DNA is being sampled, the only requirement is only not to drink coffee and not to smoke. You can take an ear swab, but that's for home conditions only. That's for sampling of your own DNA at home. As the DNA samples that are sampled in the laboratories, they are sampled by nucleocards. So use this cotton swab, a clean one. You can just rub 10 times against inside of one cheek and then another cheek, and then wrap it into a new paper envelope, and you can store it at home in home conditions without excessive heat and without excessive humidity. So this is how the buccal epithelium is being sampled. In case of necessity, for example, if our experts, all of our experts, as we enter the laboratory, we submit our DNA samples so they don't mix in the environment of the laboratory. But in order to sample DNA from the military, according to the law on state registration of genetic information, we have to sample them against nucleocards that are covered with the special solution. It's basically a small piece of paper covered in special solution that conservates the DNA sample so it can be preserved for more than 20 years. And the law says that during the martial law, it's mandatory to take samples from the military. If there is no martial law, the military may submit their DNA samples in case they want to do so. Now, there is a martial law in effect. The samples can be stored at room temperature. It should be stored at a place where they don't degrade. I don't know how they set it forth in the decrees and resolutions, but the people may just put them in paper envelope, and in case of initiation of criminal investigation of persons gone missing, the investigation officers can get access to those paper envelope, and in case the people demobilize, they can demand their DNA samples back. Well, and basically the cost of such system for prolonged storage is like from 170 to 200 hryvnia. That's not a lot of money, and international organizations keep helping us quite intensely. They send a lot of such systems for us, and we send those storage systems to the military units. That's one thing. And on top of that, we have a wonderful video describing this procedure, and we are probably going to upload it online so everybody can get familiarized. Thank you very much, dear friends. Do we have any questions on the floor? Now you have an opportunity to ask them. Anastasia Razab, Media Initiative for Human Rights. For what I understand, the biggest problem is the lack of experts who can work with processing of such a barrage of reports and applications. What can be done about it? Does the government do anything on increasing the number of experts in relevant laboratories? And if so, how soon are we going to be able to see the results? And if not, so why so? Well, talking about the expert service of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, we have more than 200 experts working with us who are certified to do the molecular and genetic testing. Now our staff was expanded. We're looking for new personnel, and we're going to teach them. We're going to train them. We train them by ourselves. They pass exams, they get certified by us, and then they proceed to the testing. Miss Lena, in your opinion, is there the lack of experts? We understand that there is an incredible workload. That's no secret to anybody. It was even before the full-scale invasion. Now this workload only is increasing. So what is the situation with the experts? Well, as I've said, our requirements were satisfied and our staff was expanded, but we have to find the experts, and now we're looking for them. Thank you very much. What I can add on part of the International Commission, let me remind you that our experts are always at the service in Ukraine. Obviously, it's not 13 laboratories that are based in Ukraine, but our laboratory works for more than 20 years on degraded tissues, on difficult cases. We have more than 20 years of experience, so we're always open to sharing our experience and to open field work in the laboratory, and so on. And at the same time, we emphasize the necessity of preparation work before the samples end up in the library. For example, about the mixed residues, mixed remnants, to save time and resources of the laboratories for this proper DNA selection, so that laboratories have less workload. And also I can say that the International Commission has different scientists working with us, and we are currently developing the new technology called next generation sequencing. For the time being, it's extremely expensive. It cannot be used on a broad scale, but talking about the context of Ukraine, like the burnt remnants, the degraded remnants, that technology can help because it allows working with the shorter distances of DNA chain and identify their distant relatives. So the more the technology is used, the more affordable it becomes. But again, our expertise is always at the service of the government agencies of Ukraine. What I wanted to add is that the samples of the bodies and DNA samples of the relatives should be studied with the similar techniques, because, for example, if we have one car that was destroyed, that was carrying 30 people, and we were knowing for sure that there were people we know their names, they bought the tickets for that bus, so we can find the relatives of those 30 people and we may match their DNAs. But in case of thousands of people, picking the relatives of that some specific degraded body that has very low quality of the material, we cannot afford studying 1,000 relatives, or otherwise we should study 1,000 relatives and to see whose DNA would be matching, or we use other methods to make sure that those methods intersect. Thank you very much. I would like to thank you for this conversation. Hopefully such communication between all of the government agencies and non-government organizations will help us identify the bodies of our defenders, of the civilians who now, during the full-scale invasion, have fallen victims of the terrorist attacks of the aggressor. Thank you very much for your interest in this topic. I would like to thank our security and defense forces for an opportunity to discuss important topics like this gathering here. So let's continue working for our victory, and glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes.